My employment contract stated that upon involuntary termination, all federal certifications and customs licenses maintained by the employee would be immediately invalidated. When my sister-in-law, our newly appointed human resources director, fired me to free up the budget, she completely overlooked the fact that the entire logistics firm operated exclusively under my personal master license. I simply smiled, signed my meager severance papers, and waited for my father to return from his European cruise to a $50 million empire that could no longer legally move a single shipping container. Before I share exactly how this corporate meltdown unfolded, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever sat across a table from toxic family members and let them dig their own graves. The air conditioning in the glass-walled conference room hummed with a sterile mechanical efficiency that perfectly matched the atmosphere of the meeting. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, looking at the single sheet of paper resting on the polished mahogany table between us. Across from me sat Chloe, my brother Jamal's wife of exactly 14 months. She wore a pristine beige blazer and a look of practiced corporate sympathy that did not reach her eyes. Beside her sat Jamal, my older brother, who was currently finding the bezel of his gold Rolex utterly fascinating, so he would not have to look me in the eye. Synergy, Chloe said, folding her hands neatly on top of her leather-bound portfolio. It is really all about synergy and eliminating redundancy across the executive branches. As the new Human Resources Director, I have been conducting a thorough audit of our departmental spending. We are streamlining the leadership structure to better align with Jamal's new strategic initiatives. I stared at her, absorbing the absolute audacity of the moment. I am Camille. I am 35 years old, and for the last 10 years, I had been the Chief Compliance Officer and sole Federal Customs Principal for our family supply chain logistics firm. I built the entire compliance department from a single filing cabinet into a streamlined operation that cleared hundreds of millions of dollars in international freight every fiscal year. I navigated the grueling federal exams, endured the background checks, and put my own name on the line to secure the master operating bonds. Jamal, on the other hand, was 38 years old and had failed out of 2 separate business programs before our father finally created a vice president title out of thin air just to give him an office. "You are eliminating redundancy," I repeated, keeping my voice entirely devoid of the raging storm brewing in my chest. "Chloe, you were a part-time lifestyle blogger before Jamal married you. Now you are the director of human resources for a federal logistics firm. Please explain to me how my role is redundant." Chloe's pale skin flushed with a sudden blotchy pink, her blue eyes narrowing as the corporate facade slipped just a fraction. "This is exactly the kind of hostile pushback that makes this transition necessary, Camille. Your salary of $120,000 is a massive drain on the family legacy. Jamal needs that budget freed up. He has a family to provide for, and his new operational initiatives require flexible capital." I knew exactly what those strategic initiatives were. Jamal and Chloe had just broken ground on a custom-built 6-bedroom mansion in a gated suburban community. The foundation was poured, the framing was up, and the construction costs were spiraling wildly out of control. My department was not redundant. My salary was simply being cannibalized to pay for Italian marble countertops and a custom wine cellar. Jamal finally stopped playing with his watch and shifted in his seat, puffing out his chest in a weak display of authority. "Look, Camille, it is nothing personal. It is just business. The industry is changing. We are pivoting toward automated software solutions. Shipping boxes is not rocket science. We do not need a massive compliance overhead when we can just outsource the basic data entry." I looked at my brother, taking in his tailored suit and the unearned arrogance radiating from his posture. "You think federal customs compliance is basic data entry?" I asked quietly. "Jamal, we move hazardous materials, agricultural imports, and heavily regulated electronics across international borders." Before Jamal could formulate a response, the speakerphone sitting in the center of the table lit up with a green light. My mother Yvonne had been listening in silently, acting as the invisible shield she had always been for her golden child. "Camille, please stop being so difficult." My mother's voice crackled through the speaker, heavy with that familiar tone of disappointed exhaustion she always reserved solely for me. Your brother is just trying to step up and take ownership of the company while your father is away. You are 35 and single. You only have yourself to worry about. Jamal has a wife. They are building a life together. You need to be a team player. Just take the severance package and let him lead. The betrayal washed over me cold and absolute. It was a familiar sensation, one I had experienced in varying degrees since childhood. Growing up in a prosperous African American household meant there was immense pressure to succeed, but the rules were always applied differently to Jamal and me. When I spent my weekends studying to maintain my academic scholarships, my parents called me antisocial. When Jamal wrecked 3 different luxury cars before his 21st birthday, my mother coddled him, blaming his wild phase on the pressures of being a young man with potential. I had spent a decade working 80-hour weeks to ensure my father's company remained legally bulletproof, sacrificing my personal life, my weekends, and my peace of mind. Now, with my father unreachable on a month-long European cruise, my mother was actively blessing my professional execution to fund her favorite child's lifestyle. "Who is taking over my duties?" I asked, directing the question to Jamal. Jamal sat up straighter, a smug grin finally breaking through his discomfort. "I already hired Tanner. You remember Tanner from my fraternity days. He just finished his communications degree. He is hungry, he is young, and he agreed to come on for half your salary. He can handle the software side of things, while Chloe manages the personnel transitions." Tanner, a 25-year-old communications major with zero logistics experience, was going to handle the federal compliance for an international supply chain. The sheer level of incompetence was staggering, but I did not let a single ounce of my shock show on my face. Instead, a strange, crystalline calm settled over my mind. For years, I had been the buffer protecting this family from its own terrible decisions. I had fixed the mistakes, paid the late fees, and smoothed over the regulatory violations Jamal caused. They genuinely believed the company ran itself. They believed my job was nothing more than printing papers and stamping forms. I reached forward and pulled the severance agreement toward me. I flipped past the standard non-disparagement clauses and the paltry offer of 2 weeks' pay. I turned directly to page 4, scanning the text until I found the exact paragraph I was looking for. I looked up at Chloe, meeting her icy blue gaze with absolute stillness. "Are you absolutely certain you want to terminate my employment effective immediately?" I asked, my voice smooth and perfectly measured. Standard company protocol for executive termination requires a 30-day transition period to ensure all departmental handovers are completed legally. Chloe let out a soft, patronizing laugh, exchanging a triumphant look with my brother. "We do not need a transition period, Camille. Tanner is highly adaptable, and frankly, having you lingering around the office being resentful would just be toxic for the company culture. We want a clean break, effective immediately." I nodded slowly, my eyes shifting to the speakerphone. "Did you hear that, Mom? Effective immediately? No transition." "I heard it, Camille." My mother sighed sharply. "Stop dragging this out and just sign the papers so your brother can get back to work. He has a lot on his plate today." I did not cry. I did not beg for my job. I did not scream about the years of my life I had sacrificed to build the foundation they were currently standing on. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my favorite Mont Blanc pen, a gift to myself, when I finally passed the grueling federal brokerage exam. As I uncapped the pen, the specific legally binding wording of my federal compliance contract echoed clearly in my mind. Upon involuntary termination of employment, all federal licenses, bonds, and digital signatures held by the employee for the company's operational use are immediately withdrawn and invalidated. They did not understand how the industry worked. They did not understand that a logistics firm cannot simply buy a license to move freight. The federal government issues those licenses to individuals, holding them personally liable for the cargo they clear. Because my father had never wanted to go through the rigorous testing and background checks himself, he had built the entire corporate structure under my personal credentials. My name was the only thing standing between our client's cargo and federal seizure. I pressed the nib of the pen to the paper and signed my name with a smooth, elegant flourish. I signed the second copy, closed the folder, and slid it back across the mahogany table to Chloe. Jamal grinned a wide, victorious expression that spoke of absolute entitlement. He thought he had just won. He thought he had successfully bullied his little sister into submission and secured his country club lifestyle. He had absolutely no idea that the moment my pen left that paper, he had just legally severed the company from the federal grid. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. I gathered my purse and looked down at the two people who had just orchestrated their own spectacular demise. "I will clear out my office," I said quietly. Chloe stood up as well, clutching the signed folder to her chest like a trophy. "Actually, Camille, company policy dictates that terminated employees cannot access their workstations unattended. We need to protect proprietary company data. I have already asked security to escort you out. We will box up your personal items and mail them to your apartment." The sheer indignity of it should have broken me. Being escorted out of my own family's building by a security guard I had personally hired, treated like a corporate spy by a woman who had never worked a real job in her life. But the cold, logical part of my brain was already 3 steps ahead. "Send it to my home address," I said politely. "Enjoy the new strategic initiatives, Jamal." I turned and walked out of the boardroom without looking back, the ticking time bomb firmly planted and silently counting down to 0. My employment contract explicitly stated that upon involuntary termination, all federal certifications and customs licenses maintained by me on behalf of the company would be immediately and permanently invalidated. When my brother and his new wife fired me to free up the executive budget, they completely overlooked the fact that the entire logistics firm operated exclusively under my personal master license. I simply smiled, signed my meager severance papers, and waited for my father to return from his European vacation to a $50 million empire that could no longer legally move a single shipping container. Before I share exactly how this corporate meltdown unfolded, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever sat across a table from toxic family members and quietly let them dig their own graves. The air conditioning in the glass-walled conference room hummed with a sterile mechanical efficiency that perfectly matched the atmosphere of the meeting. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, looking at the single sheet of paper resting on the polished mahogany table between us. Across from me sat Harper, my brother Jamal's wife of exactly 14 months. Harper was a white woman from a wealthy suburban background who had been a part-time lifestyle blogger before Jamal married her. Now, somehow, she was the director of human resources for our African-American family-owned federal logistics firm. She wore a pristine beige blazer and a look of practiced corporate sympathy that did not reach her eyes. Beside her sat Jamal, my older brother, who was currently finding the bezel of his gold Rolex utterly fascinating so he would not have to look me in the eye. "Synergy," Harper said, folding her hands neatly on top of her leather-bound portfolio. "It is really all about synergy and eliminating redundancy across the executive branches." As the new Human Resources Director, I have been conducting a thorough audit of our departmental spending. We are streamlining the leadership structure to better align with Jamal's new strategic initiatives. I stared at her, absorbing the absolute audacity of the moment. I am Camille. I am 35 years old, and for the last 10 years I had been the Chief Compliance Officer and sole Federal Customs Principal for our family supply chain logistics firm. I built the entire compliance department from a single filing cabinet into a streamlined operation that cleared hundreds of millions of dollars in international freight every fiscal year. I navigated the grueling federal exams, endured the extensive background checks, and put my own name on the line to secure the master operating bonds. Jamal, on the other hand, was 38 years old and had failed out of 2 separate business programs before our father Elijah finally created a vice president title out of thin air just to give him an office. "You are eliminating redundancy," I repeated, keeping my voice entirely devoid of the raging storm brewing in my chest. "Harper, please explain to me how my role is redundant." Harper's pale skin flushed with a sudden blotchy pink, her blue eyes narrowing as the corporate facade slipped just a fraction. "This is exactly the kind of hostile pushback that makes this transition necessary, Camille. Your salary of $120,000 is a massive drain on the family legacy." Jamal needs that budget freed up. He has a family to provide for, and his new operational initiatives require flexible capital. I knew exactly what those strategic initiatives were. Jamal and Harper had just broken ground on a custom-built 6-bedroom mansion in a gated community. The foundation was poured, the framing was up, and the construction costs were spiraling wildly out of control. My department was not redundant. My salary was simply being cannibalized to pay for Italian marble countertops in a custom wine cellar. Jamal finally stopped playing with his watch and shifted in his seat, puffing out his chest in a weak display of authority. Look, Camille, it is nothing personal. It is just business. The industry is changing. We are pivoting toward automated software solutions. Shipping boxes is not rocket science. We do not need a massive compliance overhead when we can just outsource the basic data entry. I looked at my brother taking in his tailored suit and the unearned arrogance radiating from his posture. You think federal customs compliance is basic data entry? I asked quietly. Jamal, we move hazardous materials, agricultural imports, and heavily regulated electronics across international borders. Before, Jamal could formulate a response. The speakerphone sitting in the center of the table lit up with a green light. My mother Yvonne had been listening in silently, acting as the invisible shield she had always been for her golden child. "Camille, please stop being so difficult." My mother's voice crackled through the speaker, heavy with that familiar tone of disappointed exhaustion she always reserved solely for me. "Your brother is just trying to step up and take ownership of the company while your father is away. You are 35 and single. You only have yourself to worry about. Jamal has a wife. They are building a life together. You need to be a team player. Just take the severance package and let him lead." The betrayal washed over me cold and absolute. It was a familiar sensation one I had experienced in varying degrees since childhood. Growing up, the rules were always applied differently to Jamal and me. When I spent my weekends studying to maintain my academic scholarships, my parents called me antisocial. When Jamal wrecked 3 different luxury cars before his 21st birthday, my mother coddled him, blaming his wild phase on the pressures of being a young man with potential. I had spent a decade working 80-hour weeks to ensure my father's company remained legally bulletproof, sacrificing my personal life, my weekends, and my peace of mind. Now, with my father unreachable on a month-long European cruise, my mother was actively blessing my professional execution to fund her favorite child's lifestyle. "Who is taking over my duties?" I asked, directing the question to Jamal. Jamal sat up straighter, a smug grin finally breaking through his discomfort. "I already hired Tanner. You remember Tanner from my fraternity days. He just finished his communications degree. He is hungry, he is young, and he agreed to come on for half your salary. He can handle the software side of things while Harper manages the personnel transitions." Tanner, a 25-year-old communications major with zero logistics experience, was going to handle the federal compliance for an international supply chain. The sheer level of incompetence was staggering, but I did not let a single ounce of my shock show on my face. Instead, a strange crystalline calm settled over my mind. For years, I had been the buffer protecting this family from its own terrible decisions. I had fixed the mistakes, paid the late fees, and smoothed over the regulatory violations Jamal caused. They genuinely believed the company ran itself. They believed my job was nothing more than printing papers and stamping forms. I reached forward and pulled the severance agreement toward me. I flipped past the standard non-disparagement clauses and the paltry offer of 2 weeks' pay. I turned directly to page 4, scanning the text until I found the exact paragraph I was looking for. I looked up at Harper, meeting her gaze with absolute stillness. "Are you absolutely certain you want to terminate my employment? Effective immediately?" I asked, my voice smooth and perfectly measured. Standard company protocol for executive termination requires a 30-day transition period to ensure all departmental handovers are completed legally. Harper let out a soft, patronizing laugh, exchanging a triumphant look with my brother. "We do not need a transition period, Camille. Tanner is highly adaptable, and frankly, having you lingering around the office being resentful would just be toxic for the company culture. We want a clean break, effective immediately." I nodded slowly, my eyes shifting to the speakerphone. Did you hear that, Mom? Effective immediately. No transition. I heard it, Camille. My mother sighed sharply. Stop dragging this out and just sign the paper so your brother can get back to work. He has a lot on his plate today. I did not cry. I did not beg for my job. I did not scream about the years of my life I had sacrificed to build the foundation they were currently standing on. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my favorite Mont Blanc pen, a gift to myself, when I finally passed the grueling federal brokerage exam. As I uncapped the pen, the specific legally binding wording of my federal compliance contract echoed clearly in my mind. Upon involuntary termination of employment, all federal licenses, bonds, and digital signatures held by the employee for the company's operational use are immediately withdrawn and invalidated. They did not understand how the industry worked. They did not understand that a logistics firm cannot simply buy a license to move freight. The federal government issues those licenses to individuals, holding them personally liable for the cargo they clear. Because my father had never wanted to go through the rigorous testing and background checks himself, he had built the entire corporate structure under my personal credentials. My name was the only thing standing between our client's cargo and federal seizure. I pressed the nib of the pen to the paper and signed my name with a smooth, elegant flourish. I signed the second copy, closed the folder, and slid it back across the mahogany table to Harper. Jamal grinned, a wide, victorious expression that spoke of absolute entitlement. He thought he had just won. He thought he had successfully bullied his little sister into submission and secured his luxury lifestyle. He had absolutely no idea that the moment my pen left that paper, he had just legally severed the company from the federal grid. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. I gathered my purse and looked down at the two people who had just orchestrated their own spectacular demise. I will clear out my office, I said quietly. Harper stood up as well, clutching the signed folder to her chest like a trophy. Actually, Camille company policy dictates that terminated employees cannot access their workstations unattended. We need to protect proprietary company data. I have already asked security to escort you out. We will box up your personal items and mail them to your apartment. The sheer indignity of it should have broken me. Being escorted out of my own family's building by a security guard I had personally hired, treated like a corporate spy by a woman who had never worked a day in logistics in her life. But the cold, logical part of my brain was already 3 steps ahead. 2 security guards appeared at the glass doors, looking incredibly uncomfortable as they were forced to escort their former boss down the hallway. I walked through the main bullpen with my head held high. Colleagues who had relied on my expertise for years stopped typing, staring in absolute shock as I was marched past their cubicles. I said nothing. I let Harper relish her temporary power trip, walking closely behind me to ensure everyone witnessed her newfound authority. As we passed my corner office, I saw Tanner, the frat buddy replacement, already lounging in my ergonomic chair with his feet propped up on my desk. He caught my eye and had the nerve to ask me where the extra coffee pods were kept. I just gave him a blank stare and kept walking toward the elevator banks. When the elevator doors finally opened, I stepped inside and turned to face my sister-in-law one last time. Harper smirked, clearly enjoying the theatricality of throwing me out. "Do not worry, Camille," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We will be sure to send you an invite to the housewarming party once the new mansion is finished." I held her gaze as the metal doors began to slide shut. I just smiled back at her and said, "You will not be able to afford it." The metal elevator doors slid shut, cutting off Harper's smug expression. I stood alone in the descending car, watching the digital floor numbers count down from 30 to the lobby. For a brief moment, the silence of the elevator pressed against my ears. 10 years. I had given a decade of my life to a company that just discarded me to fund a suburban mansion. My chest felt tight, but I refused to let the sting of betrayal break my composure. I had always been the diligent daughter, the one who handled the crises, the one who read the fine print. Today, the fine print was going to be my salvation. I walked across the expansive marble lobby of the corporate headquarters. The security guard at the front desk gave me a sympathetic nod. He had seen the entire spectacle of my escort. I offered him a polite smile and pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors, stepping out into the humid afternoon air. The heat felt suffocating, but my mind was completely ice cold. I made my way to the executive parking garage, my heels clicking rhythmically against the concrete. When I reached my car, I unlocked the doors and slid into the driver's seat. The leather was warm against my back. I did not start the engine immediately. Instead, I sat in the dim light of the parking structure, taking a slow, deliberate breath. The scent of my familiar perfume mingled with the sterile smell of the garage. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my personal laptop. I powered it on and connected it to my secure mobile hotspot. The screen illuminated my face, casting a pale blue glow in the shadowed car. I opened my web browser and navigated directly to the United States Customs and Border Protection secure portal. This was not a standard corporate website. This was the Federal Gateway, the central nervous system that dictated every single piece of international freight entering or leaving the country. I typed in my personal identification credentials. My fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced precision. I entered my secure password and completed the two-factor authentication. The portal dashboard loaded, displaying my name and my official customs broker license number prominently at the top of the screen. I looked at those numbers and allowed myself a moment to remember exactly what it took to earn them. The Federal Customs Broker examination has an abysmal pass rate. I had spent 8 grueling months studying federal regulations, tariff classifications, and international trade laws while working a full-time job. I passed on my first attempt. Following the exam, I underwent an invasive federal background check involving fingerprinting, financial audits, and extensive interviews. It was a rigorous process designed to ensure that only individuals with impeccable character and deep regulatory knowledge were granted the authority to clear cargo on behalf of the United States government. My father had never possessed the patience for that kind of academic rigor. Jamal certainly lacked the discipline and the clean criminal record required to even apply. So when the family logistics firm needed a licensed principal to operate legally, they had relied entirely on me. I had legally bound my personal federal license to the corporate entity. My name was the protective umbrella covering every shipment, every warehouse transfer, and every customs entry the firm processed. I clicked on the tab labeled Corporate Affiliations. A drop-down menu appeared listing the logistics firm. Beside the company name was a green indicator light, signifying an active and compliant operational status. Millions of dollars were currently in transit under that green light. Fleets of cargo ships crossing the Atlantic, trucks idling at border checkpoints, and massive warehouses waiting for clearance approvals. All of it rested squarely on my digital signature. I hovered my cursor over the link that read Manage Affiliation. I clicked it. The screen transitioned to a new page presenting a series of administrative options. I scrolled down to the bottom, where a stark red button stood out against the white background. It read Sever Affiliation. I paused. I thought about Jamal handing my corner office over to a 25-year-old fraternity brother. I thought about Harper patronizing me about my salary while she planned her custom wine cellar. I thought about my mother telling me to step aside and let my incompetent brother lead simply because he demanded the spotlight. They wanted to run a supply chain empire without the single pillar holding it up. I clicked the red button. A severe warning prompt instantly popped up on the center of my screen. The text was bold and unapologetic. It stated, "Warning. Severing this corporate affiliation will immediately invalidate the federal operating bond for the selected entity. The company will instantly lose all customs clearance privileges. This action will freeze all pending corporate imports and flag current shipments for federal review. Do you wish to proceed due to termination of employment?" The system required a typed confirmation, a digital signature confirming that the action was intentional and legally sound. I placed my hands back on the keyboard. I typed my full legal name, confirming that my employment had been involuntarily terminated without a transition period, just as Harper had insisted. I checked the box confirming that I was legally withdrawing my personal liability from the corporate entity. There was no hesitation left in my body. There was only a profound sense of justice. I clicked confirm. The portal loaded for exactly 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds felt like a lifetime. Then the screen refreshed. The green indicator light next to my family company vanished. In its place, a bright flashing red status indicator appeared. Status invalid. Operating privileges revoked. It was done. The corporate umbilical cord was officially cut. The $50 million logistics firm was now effectively paralyzed, operating completely blind in the eyes of the federal government. Every automated clearance request they attempted to file from this second forward would be automatically rejected. Every shipping container currently sitting at a port of entry would be flagged and held by customs enforcement. The company was now just a collection of empty warehouses and grounded trucks. I calmly logged out of the federal portal and closed my laptop. I placed it back into my tote bag and finally pushed the start button on my dashboard. The engine purred to life. I pulled out of the parking space, leaving the corporate headquarters behind me. I merged onto the bustling city streets, driving toward the downtown arts district. The sun was shining brightly, casting sharp shadows against the high-rise buildings. I felt a tremendous weight lift from my shoulders. For 10 years, I had carried the anxiety of federal compliance for ungrateful people. Now I only had to carry myself. I pulled up to the valet stand of my favorite upscale brunch restaurant. It was a beautiful spot, known for its imported coffees and flawless service. I handed my keys to the attendant and walked inside. The hostess greeted me warmly and led me to a quiet, sunlit table by the window. I sat down, smoothing my napkin over my lap, and ordered a mimosa and their signature avocado toast. I leaned back against the plush velvet seating, listening to the soft jazz playing through the restaurant speakers. The trap was set and the countdown had officially begun. My termination contract clearly stated that if I was ever fired without a standard transition period, every single federal customs license attached to my name would be instantly and permanently revoked. When my brother and his newly appointed Human Resources Director wife decided to fire me to free up the executive budget, they completely forgot that my personal credentials were the only thing keeping our family $50 million supply chain empire legally operational. I simply smiled, signed the severance papers, and waited for the Port Authority to freeze every single cargo container they had in transit. Before I share exactly how this corporate meltdown unfolded, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever sat across a table from toxic family members and quietly let them dig their own graves. Growing up in an affluent African-American household in Atlanta, the pressure to succeed was a heavy, suffocating blanket. But the rules of success were always applied differently to me than they were to my older brother Jamal. While I spent my weekends studying to maintain my academic scholarships, my parents called me antisocial and too serious. When Jamal wrecked 3 different luxury cars before his 21st birthday and failed out of 2 separate business programs, my mother coddled him, blaming his wild phase on the unique pressures of being a young man with potential. I had spent a decade working 80-hour weeks to ensure my father's company remained legally bulletproof, sacrificing my personal life, my weekends, and my peace of mind. Now that lifetime of disparate treatment was culminating in the most profound betrayal I had ever experienced. The air conditioning in the glass-walled conference room hummed with a sterile mechanical efficiency that perfectly matched the atmosphere of the meeting. I sat in my high-backed leather chair, looking at the single sheet of paper resting on the polished mahogany table between us. Across from me sat Harper, my brother Jamal's wife, of exactly 14 months. Harper was a white woman from a wealthy suburban background who had been a part-time lifestyle blogger before Jamal married her. Now, somehow she was the director of human resources for our family-owned federal logistics firm. She wore a pristine beige blazer and a look of practiced corporate sympathy that did not quite reach her eyes. Beside her sat Jamal, who was currently finding the bezel of his gold Rolex utterly fascinating, so he would not have to look me in the eye. Synergy, Harper said, folding her hands neatly on top of her leather-bound portfolio. It is really all about synergy and eliminating redundancy across the executive branches. As the new Human Resources Director, I have been conducting a thorough audit of our departmental spending. We are streamlining the leadership structure to better align with Jamal's new strategic initiatives. I stared at her, absorbing the absolute audacity of the moment. I am Camille. I am 35 years old, And for the last 10 years, I had been the chief compliance officer and sole federal customs principal for our supply chain logistics firm. I built the entire compliance department from a single filing cabinet into a streamlined operation that cleared hundreds of millions of dollars in international freight every fiscal year. I navigated the grueling federal exams, endured the extensive background checks, and put my own name on the line to secure the master operating bonds. Jamal, on the other hand, had drifted aimlessly until our father Elijah finally created a vice president title out of thin air just to give him an office. "You are eliminating redundancy," I repeated, keeping my voice entirely devoid of the raging storm brewing in my chest. "Harper, please explain to me how my role is redundant." Harper's pale skin flushed with a sudden blotchy pink, her blue eyes narrowing as the corporate facade slipped just a fraction. "This is exactly the kind of hostile pushback that makes this transition necessary, Camille. Your salary of $120,000 is a massive drain on the family legacy. Jamal needs that budget freed up. He has a family to provide for, and his new operational initiatives require flexible capital." I knew exactly what those strategic initiatives were. Jamal and Harper had just broken ground on a custom-built 6-bedroom mansion in a gated community. The foundation was poured, the framing was up, and the construction costs were spiraling wildly out of control. My department was not redundant. My salary was simply being cannibalized to pay for Italian marble countertops and a custom wine cellar. Jamal finally stopped playing with his watch and shifted in his seat, puffing out his chest in a weak display of authority. "Look, Camille, it is nothing personal. It is just business. The industry is changing. We are pivoting toward automated software solutions. Shipping boxes is not rocket science. We do not need a massive compliance overhead when we can just outsource the basic data entry." I looked at my brother taking in his tailored suit and the unearned arrogance radiating from his posture. "You think federal customs compliance is basic data entry?" I asked quietly. "Jamal, we move hazardous materials, agricultural imports, and heavily regulated electronics across international borders. We deal with Homeland Security, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Environmental Protection Agency on a daily basis." Before Jamal could formulate a response, the speakerphone sitting in the center of the table lit up with a green light. My mother Yvonne had been listening in silently, acting as the invisible shield she had always been for her golden child. "Camille, please stop being so difficult." My mother's voice crackled through the speaker, heavy with that familiar tone of disappointed exhaustion she always reserved solely for me. "Your brother is just trying to step up and take ownership of the company while your father is away. You are 35 and single. You only have yourself to worry about. Jamal has a wife. They are building a life together. You need to be a team player. Just take the severance package and let him lead." The betrayal washed over me cold and absolute. With my father currently unreachable on a month-long European cruise, my mother was actively blessing my professional execution to fund her favorite child's lifestyle. She did not care about the business. She only cared that Jamal got whatever he demanded. "Who is taking over my duties?" I asked, directing the question back to Jamal. Jamal sat up straighter, a smug grin finally breaking through his discomfort. "I already hired Tanner. You remember Tanner from my fraternity days? He just finished his communications degree. He is hungry, he is young, and he agreed to come on for half your salary. He can handle the software side of things while Harper manages the personnel transitions." Tanner, a 25-year-old communications major with zero logistics experience, was going to handle the federal compliance for an international supply chain. The sheer level of incompetence was staggering, but I did not let a single ounce of my shock show on my face. Instead, a strange crystalline calm settled over my mind. For years, I had been the buffer protecting this family from its own terrible decisions. I had fixed the mistakes, paid the late fees, and smoothed over the regulatory violations Jamal caused. They genuinely believed the company ran itself. They believed my job was nothing more than printing papers and stamping forms. I reached forward and pulled the severance agreement toward me. I flipped past the standard non-disparagement clauses and the paltry offer of 2 weeks' pay. I turned directly to page 4, scanning the text until I found the exact paragraph I was looking for. I looked up at Harper, meeting her gaze with absolute stillness. Are you absolutely certain you want to terminate my employment? Effective immediately? I asked, my voice smooth and perfectly measured. Standard company protocol for executive termination requires a 30-day transition period to ensure all departmental handovers are completed legally. Harper let out a soft, patronizing laugh, exchanging a triumphant look with my brother. We do not need a transition period, Camille. Tanner is highly adaptable, and frankly, having you lingering around the office being resentful would just be toxic for the company culture. We want a clean break, effective immediately. I nodded slowly, my eyes shifting to the speakerphone. Did you hear that, Mom? Effective immediately? No transition. I heard it, Camille. My mother sighed sharply. Stop dragging this out and just sign the paper so your brother can get back to work. He has a lot on his plate today. I did not cry. I did not beg for my job. I did not scream about the years of my life I had sacrificed to build the foundation they were currently standing on. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my favorite Mont Blanc pen, a gift to myself, when I finally passed the grueling federal brokerage exam. As I uncapped the pen, the specific legally binding wording of my federal compliance contract echoed clearly in my mind. Upon involuntary termination of employment, all federal licenses, bonds, and digital signatures held by the employee for the company's operational use are immediately withdrawn and invalidated. They did not understand how the industry worked. They did not understand that a logistics firm cannot simply buy a license to move freight. The federal government issues those licenses to individuals, holding them personally liable for the cargo they clear. Because my father had never wanted to go through the rigorous testing and background checks himself, he had built the entire corporate structure under my personal credentials. My name was the only thing standing between our client's cargo and federal seizure. I pressed the nib of the pen to the paper and signed my name with a smooth, elegant flourish. I signed the second copy, closed the folder, and slid it back across the mahogany table to Harper. Jamal grinned, a wide, victorious expression that spoke of absolute entitlement. He thought he had just won. He thought he had successfully bullied his little sister into submission and secured his luxury lifestyle. He had absolutely no idea that the moment my pen left that paper, he had just legally severed the company from the federal grid. The ticking time bomb had just been activated, and they were the ones who had joyfully handed me the detonator. My phone danced across the smooth marble surface of the cafe table, vibrating violently with a relentless stream of notifications. I took a slow, deliberate bite of my avocado toast, letting the chaos unfold digitally before I even bothered to look at the screen. I knew exactly what was happening. The Port of Savannah is notorious for its complete lack of patience. When a master customs license is flagged as invalid, the automated systems do not gently ask for clarification. They drop a digital guillotine on every single piece of freight associated with that broker. I picked up my phone and unlocked it. The family group chat was a masterclass in escalating panic. It started with Jamal sending a screenshot of an error code from his office computer. The message read simply, "System error at port. Containers locked. Camille, call the IT desk and tell them to reset the server." He still thought this was a minor computer glitch. He genuinely believed that the federal government freezing millions of dollars in international freight was just a router issue that his little sister could fix with a phone call. 10 minutes later, the tone of his messages shifted dramatically. The client, representing one of the largest automotive parts distributors on the East Coast, had received the same notification from the Port Authority. They had 60 containers of highly sensitive components sitting on the scorching Georgia tarmac, unable to be loaded onto the distribution trucks. Demurrage fees at the port compound by the hour. Jamal's texts were coming in rapid fire. Camille, the client, is threatening a $500,000 penalty if those containers do not move by 3 o'clock. Log into the portal from your laptop right now. I know you are still in the city. Just clear the error code. We do not have time for you to be petty about this morning. Do it as a favor to the family before Dad finds out. The absolute audacity of my brother was breathtaking. Less than 2 hours ago, he had sat back and watched his wife strip away my livelihood to fund their extravagant lifestyle. Now he was ordering me to commit a federal crime as a favor. He still viewed me as the family fixer, the invisible safety net that existed solely to catch him whenever his incompetence sent him plummeting toward the ground. I set my mimosa down and wiped my mouth with a linen napkin. I opened the keyboard on my phone and crafted my response with icy, absolute precision. I did not use exclamation points. I did not use angry emojis. I used the law. I typed, "I am no longer an employee of the company." My termination was made effective immediately, without a transition period per Harper's explicit instructions. Accessing a United States Customs portal on behalf of an entity I am not legally affiliated with is a federal felony. I strongly suggest your new Human Resources Director figures out how to clear your freight. Good luck with the penalty. I hit send and watched the message drop into the group chat. I could almost feel the shockwave radiating from the corporate office across town. For my entire life, I had never said no to a family crisis. I had always compromised my own boundaries to maintain the peace. Sending that text felt like breaking chains I had worn for a decade. The group chat went dead silent. For exactly 4 minutes, there was no typing indicator from Jamal. He was likely staring at his screen, finally realizing that the magic button he thought I possessed was actually a federal license he had just carelessly thrown in the trash. Then my screen lit up with a private direct message. It was not from Jamal. It was from Harper. She had entirely dropped the polished corporate vocabulary she used in the conference room. The polished human resources director was gone, replaced by an entitled, furious woman who was watching her multi-million-dollar custom mansion slip through her fingers. Her text was a frantic block of aggressive demands. "You are acting like a bitter child, Camille. You purposefully set us up to fail because you are jealous of Jamal's promotion. Log into that system and fix this right now, or I swear I will put a stop payment on your severance check. Do not test me. I will make sure you never work in this industry again." I stared at her message, genuinely amazed by her profound lack of understanding. She was threatening to withhold a severance check of roughly $4,000 as leverage against a $500,000 corporate penalty. She thought she held the high ground. She thought her empty threats carried weight because she had never actually faced a problem that could not be solved by complaining to a manager. She was trying to manage a federal crisis with the tactics of a neighborhood dispute. I did not reply to her. Giving her a response would validate her delusion that she had any authority over me. Instead, I tapped the information icon at the top of her contact profile. I scrolled to the bottom of the screen and pressed block caller. I did the exact same thing to Jamal's number. I was not going to spend my first afternoon of freedom fielding their panicked abuse. They had wanted a clean break, and I was giving them exactly what they asked for. I placed my phone face down on the marble table. The sunlight caught the condensation on my champagne flute. The restaurant around me hummed with the pleasant chatter of people enjoying their day, completely unaware of the corporate empire currently burning to the ground just a few miles away. I knew blocking them would not end the conflict. My brother was a man who had never been told no, and he was cornered. Harper was a woman terrified of losing her newfound status. They would not accept defeat through a text message. They would escalate. They would try to force my hand because taking responsibility for their own catastrophic failure was not in their emotional vocabulary. But I was ready. I finished my meal, paid the check with a generous tip, and walked out into the warm afternoon air. I knew exactly who they would deploy next. They would send the one person they always used to bring me to heel. They would send my mother. And for the first time in my 35 years of life, I was fully prepared to watch her realize that her golden child was entirely made of brass. I returned to my apartment feeling a sense of profound tranquility that I had not experienced in over a decade. My home was my sanctuary. I had purchased this space with my own savings, decorating it with warm earth tones and art that brought me peace. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, high-pressure environment of my father's corporate headquarters. I took off my blazer, hung it carefully in the closet, and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water. I walked over to my living room window and looked out at the Atlanta skyline. For the first time, my afternoon did not belong to a frantic client or a looming federal deadline. It belonged entirely to me. That peace lasted for exactly 1 hour. The loud, insistent pounding on my front door echoed through the quiet apartment. It was not a polite knock. It was the heavy, entitled banging of someone who believed they owned whatever space they were trying to enter. I did not need to check the security camera to know who was standing out in the hallway, but I walked over and checked the monitor anyway. My mother Yvonne was pacing back and forth in front of my door. She was clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest, her expression twisted into a knot of furious impatience. I took a deep breath, unlocking the deadbolt and pulling the door open. Yvonne did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask how I felt after being humiliated and escorted out of the building where I had worked for 10 years. She simply pushed past me, her expensive perfume filling my entryway as she marched directly into my living room. "Camille, this petty little game of yours ends right now," my mother demanded, turning to face me with her hands planted firmly on her hips. "Jamal is practically having a heart attack at the office. You need to write down your login credentials for the Port Authority portal and give them to me this instant. I am taking them straight back to headquarters so your brother can release that cargo." I closed the front door slowly, making sure the latch clicked securely into place. I turned to look at the woman who had enabled my brother's destructive behavior for his entire life. She was looking at me with the exact same expression she used when we were children, whenever she forced me to give Jamal my allowance because he had already spent his. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm and measured. "You cannot simply log in and press a button. That is not how federal customs enforcement works." "Do not use that patronizing tone with me," she snapped back. "I am your mother. Your brother told me everything. He said you locked the company out of the system because you are throwing a tantrum over Harper letting you go. We are a family, Camille. We stick together when things get difficult. You do not try to sabotage your own flesh and blood just because your feelings got hurt." "My feelings were not hurt," I replied, walking over to the kitchen island and leaning against the cool granite. "I was legally terminated without cause. Harper made it perfectly clear that my salary was needed for Jamal's new initiatives. They wanted me gone. I complied." Yvonne waved her hand dismissively through the air as if she could simply swat away the facts. "Harper is young, and she was just trying to show initiative in her new human resources role. Jamal was stressed about his new responsibilities as vice president. They made a hasty decision. We can discuss your severance package later. Right now I need that password. Give it to me, Camille." I looked at her, truly amazed by the depth of her delusion. Mom listened to me very carefully. "The credentials for the master operating license are not like a streaming service password. You cannot just share them with anyone who wants to log in. That license is inextricably tied to my personal social security number. It is tied to my biometric data. To get that license, I had to pass a grueling background check conducted by the Department of Homeland Security." Yvonne rolled her eyes, completely unfazed by the legal reality I was trying to explain. "The federal government does not care who clicks the mouse, Camille. Just give Jamal the password so Tanner can process the paperwork. Nobody will ever know the difference. If Jamal or Tanner use my digital signature, it is identity theft and federal fraud," I stated firmly. "Furthermore, Jamal could never hold that license himself. You know that. The federal government conducts deep background investigations. They look at criminal records. They look at financial history. Do you really think Homeland Security is going to grant a master customs license to a man with 2 driving under the influence convictions on his record?" My mother flinched as if I had physically struck her. "We do not talk about those incidents," she hissed, her voice dropping to an angry whisper. "Those were mistakes he made when he was young. Your father paid good money to have those records sealed locally. Local judges cannot hide things from federal auditors, Mom." I pushed back, refusing to let her rewrite history. "Jamal could never pass the clearance. He cannot do my job. Tanner cannot do my job. Neither of them possesses the legal authority to move a single box of freight across an international border. The company is frozen because Jamal and Harper fired the only person legally authorized to operate it." Yvonne's face contorted with pure, unadulterated rage. "You are so bitter," she screamed, taking a step towards me. "You have always been jealous of your brother. You are jealous that your father promoted him to vice president instead of you. You are jealous that he has a beautiful wife like Harper, and a family, and a new house being built. You have nothing but your job, and now you are trying to destroy his life just to prove a point. You are a selfish, miserable woman, Camille." I stood my ground, letting her venomous words wash over me. For years, statements like that would have shattered my confidence. I would have internalized the guilt, apologized, and scrambled to fix whatever mess Jamal had created just to earn a crumb of my mother's approval. But standing there in my own home looking at her desperate attempts to protect a fully grown man from the consequences of his own arrogance, I felt nothing but pity. I am not destroying his life, I said quietly. I am simply letting him experience the reality he demanded. Before Yvonne could scream another insult at me, a shrill ringing sound pierced the air. It was her cell phone buried deep inside her designer handbag. She glared at me, breathing heavily before digging her hand into the bag and pulling out the phone. She glanced at the screen and her expression immediately shifted from furious anger to maternal concern. It was Jamal. She answered the call and put the phone on speaker, intending to show me how much distress I was supposedly causing my brother. Jamal, honey, I am at your sister's apartment right now, Yvonne said soothingly. Do not worry, I am going to get the password from her. Mom Jamal's voice echoed through the small speaker. He did not sound arrogant anymore. He did not sound like the smug executive who had sat in the conference room that morning. He sounded absolutely terrified. He was hyperventilating his breaths, coming in short, ragged gasps that distorted his words. Jamal, baby, calm down. Yvonne pleaded, her own panic rising as she heard the sheer terror in her golden child's voice. What is wrong? Just tell me what is happening. The Port Authority did not just freeze the containers. Jamal stammered, his voice cracking with hysteria. The system flagged us. Tanner tried to override the error code by faking a signature on the temporary import manifest. Mom, they flagged it as a federal security breach. I leaned forward against the kitchen counter, my eyes fixed on the phone in my mother's trembling hand. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had caught the entire executive suite in its steel jaws. Jamal had panicked, and his inexperienced frat buddy replacement had done exactly what I assumed he would do. He had tried to cheat a federal system. What does that mean? Yvonne asked, her voice trembling. What did they do? Jamal let out a sound that was half sob and half gasp. Mom, you need to get Camille down here right now. Please, you have to bring her to the office. I cannot do that, Jamal, she promised frantically. I will make her come. Just tell me what is going on at the office. Jamal took a shuddering breath, and the next words he spoke completely drained all the color from my mother's face. They are here, Mom. Federal agents just walked into the lobby. They are asking for the compliance director, and they are locking down the building. The words hung in the air of my apartment, thick and suffocating. My mother stared at her as if the device itself had just caught fire. Her meticulously applied makeup could not hide the sudden stark terror washing over her features. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, silently begging me to say this was some kind of elaborate prank. But I knew exactly what federal protocol looked like. Jamal, what do you mean they are locking down the building? My mother asked, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words. Who is locking down the building? Customs and Border Protection. Jamal practically sobbed through the speaker. He was no longer trying to maintain his corporate authority. The facade had completely shattered, and Homeland Security investigations, they have windbreakers on Mom. They told the security guards to lock the front doors. Nobody is allowed in or out. They are holding a clipboard and asking for Camille. They said our operating license was flagged for fraudulent transmission. I leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing my arms over my chest. The reality of what Tanner had done was coming into sharp, terrifying focus. What did Tanner do, Jamal? I asked, my voice cutting through his panic with absolute clarity. Tell me exactly what your new compliance director did to get my freight moving. There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the muffled sounds of chaos in the background at the corporate office. Phones were ringing off the hook. Someone was shouting in the hallway. He just tried to push the paperwork through. Jamal stammered, his voice defensive. Even in his terror, the Port Authority portal was locked, so Tanner found an old cached copy of your digital signature stamp on the shared server. He attached it to a manual override manifest and submitted it directly to the Savannah Port Authority. He was just trying to bypass the error code so the client would not penalize us. He did not know it would trigger an alarm. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, genuinely astounded by the sheer magnitude of their stupidity. Tanner did not trigger an alarm, Jamal, I explained, keeping my tone entirely conversational. Tanner committed identity theft against a federal agency. He forged a licensed customs broker signature on a highly regulated international shipping manifest. That is a direct violation of federal law. The system did not glitch. It did exactly what it was designed to do when an unlicensed entity attempts to move international freight using stolen credentials. It triggered a federal fraud investigation. Jamal let out a sound that was half gasp, half whimper. I am in my office, he whispered frantically. I locked the glass doors to the executive suite. I told Harper to stay in the human resources department and not say anything. Tanner is out in the bullpen. I think they are talking to him right now. Mom, you have to get Camille down here. If she just tells them she authorized Tanner to use her signature, they will leave. Tell them it was a training exercise. Tell them she forgot to log the transition. My mother gripped the phone with both hands. Did you hear him, Camille? She pleaded, stepping toward me. You need to put your shoes on right now. We are driving down there. You are going to walk into that lobby and clear this up. You are going to tell those agents that Tanner was acting under your direct supervision. I stared at the woman who had brought me into this world. I looked at the desperation in her eyes, the complete willingness to sacrifice my freedom, my flawless professional record, and my entire future, just to save her golden child from the consequences of his own arrogance. Mom, I said, pushing myself off the counter and standing tall. Lying to federal agents during an active fraud investigation is a felony. It carries a mandatory prison sentence. You are asking me to commit perjury, destroy my federal license, and risk going to federal prison just to cover up the fact that your son hired an incompetent frat boy to replace me. Yvonne shook her head violently, refusing to accept the reality of the situation. They will not send you to prison. You have a clean record. You are a respectable woman. You can just explain that it was a simple misunderstanding during a corporate restructuring. You have been dealing with these agencies for 10 years. They know you. They trust you. Use your relationships to protect your brother. He has a wife. He has a new house being built. His whole life will be ruined if this gets out. And my life, I asked quietly. Does my life matter at all in this equation? Does my freedom matter? Do not be so dramatic. She snapped, her panic transforming back into anger. No one is going to jail. You are just trying to punish him because Harper fired you this morning. You are letting your petty jealousy destroy your father's company. Get your purse. We are leaving. Jamal's voice echoed from the phone again, frantic and breathless. Mom, they are walking toward the executive suites. I can see them through the blinds. They have Tanner with them. He is crying. He is crying. Mom, what do I do? What do I tell them? You tell them the truth, Jamal, I said, leaning closer to the phone. You tell them that your human resources director terminated the company's only licensed customs principal effective immediately. You tell them that you hired an unlicensed 25-year-old to handle international freight. And you tell them that you have absolutely no legal authority to operate the business you are currently sitting in. Camille, please, Jamal begged. The unearned arrogance he had displayed just a few hours ago was completely gone. He sounded like a terrified little boy. Please, I am your brother. You have to help me. I do not know how to handle these people. They look serious. I will give you your job back. I will double your salary. Just come down here and make them go away. You cannot give me my job back, Jamal, I replied smoothly. Harper made sure my termination was filed, signed, and legally binding. She wanted a clean break, and she got one. I no longer have the security clearance to access those files, and I certainly do not have the legal obligation to negotiate with Homeland Security on your behalf. The sound of heavy, authoritative knocking echoed through the speakerphone. It was followed by a loud, muffled voice demanding that the door to the executive suite be unlocked immediately. Jamal let out a muffled curse. I have to hang up, he whispered in sheer terror. Mom, do something. Make her come down here. The line went dead. The silence in my apartment returned heavy and absolute. Yvonne stared at her phone screen for a long moment before slowly raising her eyes to meet mine. She looked completely hollowed out. The illusion of her perfect, successful son had just been raided by federal agents. and the reality was too massive for her to manipulate or sweep under the rug. She could not write a check to make Homeland Security go away. She could not bully them into submission. She stepped toward me, her hands trembling. "Camille, I am begging you, as your mother, please, go down there and fix this. He does not know what he is doing. He is in over his head. If your father finds out about this, he will be devastated. The fines alone could bankrupt the family. Please just go down there and tell them it was a mistake." I walked over to the coffee table and picked up my glass of sparkling water. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat. I looked at my mother, seeing her clearly for the first time in my life. I saw the manipulation. I saw the relentless enabling. I saw the toxic family dynamic that had kept me running on a hamster wheel of anxiety for a decade, always fixing, always compromising, always carrying the weight of their failures. I set the glass back down. I looked her directly in the eyes. "I do not work there, Mom. Remember, I was redundant." My mother stared at me, the color completely draining from her face. For my entire life, she had possessed a counter-argument for everything I said. She had a justification for every one of Jamal's failures, and a harsh critique for every one of my successes. But standing in my kitchen, listening to the muffled sounds of federal agents tearing apart her son's executive suite, over the speakerphone, she finally had absolutely nothing to say. She turned around, her shoulders slumped, and walked out of my apartment. She did not slam the door. She closed it with a quiet, defeated click that echoed louder than any scream ever could. The next 48 hours were an absolute, unmitigated bloodbath. In the world of international logistics, time is not just money. Time is everything. Without a licensed customs broker legally bound to the corporate entity, the company was completely paralyzed. The federal government does not make exceptions for family drama or corporate restructuring. They operate on strict regulatory compliance, and my family's firm currently had none. I sat on my sofa with a cup of herbal tea, watching the industry news feeds and checking the maritime tracking networks I still had access to. The scale of the gridlock was staggering. At the port of Savannah, over 100 containers of perishable agricultural imports were sitting on the scorching asphalt, slowly rotting inside their steel confines. At the port of Los Angeles, thousands of highly regulated electronic components destined for major retail chains were red-flagged and quarantined by Homeland Security. Independent truckers contracted by the company were grounded at the borders, their rigs idling while they furiously called the dispatch center, demanding to know why their load manifests were being violently rejected by Border Patrol agents. The company's massive storage warehouses were completely bottlenecked, unable to receive new freight or release current inventory. Every single minute that ticked by cost the firm tens of thousands of dollars in demurrage fees, missed delivery penalties, and spoiled goods. Jamal was entirely out of his depth. He had spent his brief tenure as vice president taking long lunches, playing golf with prospective clients, and bragging about his operational strategies. But when faced with an actual catastrophic systemic failure, he completely crumbled. You cannot charm your way out of a federal customs violation. The clients he had spent weeks schmoozing were now furiously pulling their contracts. The automotive parts distributor that had originally triggered the alarm was already filing a massive lawsuit against the firm for breach of contract and gross negligence. The corporate grapevine in the supply chain sector is incredibly small, and word travels fast. Everyone in the industry knew what was happening. They knew federal agents had raided the building, and they knew it was because an unlicensed amateur had tried to forge a federal customs clearance. Jamal's professional reputation was being meticulously shredded in real time. On the evening of the second day, my cell phone rang. The caller identification displayed an unknown local number. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, pressing the phone to my ear without saying a word. "Camille." It was Harper. She was calling from a burner phone, likely because federal agents had confiscated her corporate devices during the audit. The smug, patronizing corporate jargon she had weaponized against me in the conference room was entirely gone. Her voice was thin, high-pitched, and trembling. She sounded like she was crying, her breath hitching unevenly between her words. "Camille, please, you have to help us. The feds are freezing everything. They are talking about criminal charges for Tanner, and they keep interrogating Jamal. The contractors are placing liens on the new house because Jamal's corporate accounts are locked. We are going to lose the house, Camille. We are going to lose everything. I remained perfectly silent, listening to the sheer desperation in her voice. She was watching her custom marble countertops and her unearned luxury lifestyle evaporate before her eyes. When I did not respond, her panic rapidly morphed into the entitled aggression I knew so well. "You did this on purpose," she sobbed, her voice rising to a hysterical shriek. "You set us up. You knew the license was tied to your name and you let me fire you anyway. I am going to sue you, Camille. I am going to sue you for breach of contract, for corporate sabotage, and for intentional infliction of emotional distress. You cannot just walk away and let our lives be destroyed." I let her finish her frantic, disjointed threat. I took a slow breath, channeling every ounce of professional restraint I had perfected over the last decade. "Harper," I said, my voice as cold and smooth as fresh ice, "I highly suggest you stop making legal threats that you do not understand. You cannot sue me for breach of contract because you are the one who severed it. I am entirely compliant with the law." I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her squirm before I read her own termination speech back to her. "As the Director of Human Resources, it was your sole responsibility to conduct a thorough audit of departmental dependencies before executing a termination. You chose to eliminate my redundancy to align with Jamal's strategic initiatives. You handed me a legally binding severance agreement, and you explicitly waived the standard 30-day transition period. You wanted a clean break effective immediately, and you had me escorted out of the building to protect proprietary data. I did exactly what you demanded. But Camille," she whimpered, the fight completely draining out of her, "we did not know." "Ignorance of federal regulations is not a valid legal defense," I replied smoothly. "I am a private citizen operating within my legal rights. You, however, are an executive officer of a company that just attempted to push international freight using stolen federal credentials. That makes you an accessory to federal fraud. If I were you, I would stop worrying about your custom wine cellar and start looking for a very good criminal defense attorney." I pulled the phone away from my ear and hit the end call button, cutting off her frantic sobbing mid-sentence. I blocked the burner number immediately. The satisfaction that washed over me was absolute. They had tried to bury me, completely unaware that I was the seed that grew the entire forest. I tossed my phone onto the sofa cushion and walked into my kitchen to pour a fresh glass of water. I had barely taken a sip when my phone lit up and began to ring again. I assumed Harper had found another burner phone to call from, but when I looked at the caller identification, I froze. It was not Harper. It was not Jamal. It was not my mother. The name flashing on the screen was Victor Sterling. He was the chief executive officer of Vanguard Logistics, our family's biggest, wealthiest, and most ruthlessly aggressive competitor in the global supply chain industry. I set my water glass down on the counter and picked up the phone. I swiped the screen to answer. "Camille," Victor said, his deep, resonant voice carrying an unmistakable note of predatory respect. "I hear there is blood in the water over at your father's company, and I hear you are currently a free agent. I think it is time we had a meeting." The phone call from Victor Sterling hung in the air long after the line went dead. Victor was not just a competitor. He was the apex predator of the southeastern logistics grid. While my father built his company on legacy relationships and country club handshakes, Victor had built Vanguard Logistics on ruthless efficiency and technological superiority. For 10 years, I had treated Vanguard as the enemy, constantly strategizing to keep our clients from jumping ship to his state-of-the-art operation. Now, the chief executive officer of the enemy camp was inviting me into his fortress, and I was going to walk through the front door with a smile on my face. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet. I bypassed the muted conservative blazers my mother always insisted I wear to project a softer, less intimidating image. Instead, I pulled out a striking tailored crimson suit. I paired it with my sharpest stilettos and gathered my leather briefcase. I was no longer the exhausted, underappreciated sister trying to keep the peace. I was a free agent holding the most valuable regulatory leverage in the entire state. The drive to the Vanguard corporate campus took 20 minutes. Unlike my father's headquarters, which was located in an aging industrial park, Vanguard occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming glass skyscraper in the center of the financial district. I handed my keys to the valet and walked into the grand lobby. The space was immaculate, buzzing with the quiet, focused energy of a company that actually knew what it was doing. I approached the front desk, and before I could even introduce myself, the receptionist smiled warmly. "Mr. Sterling is expecting you, Camille. You can take the private elevator straight to the penthouse." The doors opened directly into an expansive reception area on the top floor. Victor Sterling was standing by a massive floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling city traffic. He was a striking African-American man in his early 60s, with silver hair clipped close to his scalp and a custom charcoal suit that fit him perfectly. He turned as I entered, and his eyes were sharp, calculating, and completely devoid of the unearned arrogance my brother carried. "Camille," he said, walking forward and extending a firm hand. "It is an absolute pleasure to finally meet the architect behind your father's compliance division. Please have a seat." We sat across from each other at a sleek, minimalist glass table. There was no small talk. Victor did not offer me coffee or ask about the weather. He respected my time too much for that. "I know exactly what is happening over at your family's firm right now." Victor began lacing his fingers together. "The industry rumor mill is working overtime, but I do not operate on rumors. I operate on facts. The facts are that Jamal just triggered a massive federal audit. Your family's entire fleet is grounded, and you are the only licensed customs principal who can legally clean up the bloodbath. I also know that Jamal's new human resources director walked you out of the building yesterday morning." I kept my expression perfectly composed. "Your intelligence gathering is impeccable, Victor. They wanted a clean break. They got one." Victor let out a deep, rumbling laugh. "Your brother is an absolute fool. I have spent a decade trying to poach your biggest clients, and every single time those clients stayed because they trusted your regulatory safety net. You were the only reason that company remained competitive. Now that Jamal has effectively set fire to his own ship, I want you on mine." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope. He slid it across the glass table until it rested directly in front of me. "That is a formal offer of employment," Victor said, his tone turning strictly business. "I want you at Vanguard as my Senior Vice President of Global Compliance. The base salary is $250,000, which I believe is more than double what your father was paying you. I am also offering a $50,000 signing bonus effective the moment your ink hits that paper. You will have a dedicated team of 20 specialists, a corner office, and complete operational autonomy." I looked at the thick envelope resting on the table. $300,000 in total compensation for my first year. It was life-changing money. It was the exact kind of valuation I had begged my father for over the last 5 years, only to be told that the family business could not sustain that kind of overhead. Victor was offering me a golden parachute, a chance to walk into a ready-made empire and be treated with the professional reverence I actually deserved. But as I stared at the crisp white paper, an image flashed in my mind. I saw Harper sliding that pathetic severance agreement across the mahogany table. I heard my mother telling me to step aside and let my brother lead. I realized that if I signed Victor's contract, I would just be trading one corporate leash for another. I would still be an employee. I would still be generating wealth for someone else's legacy. I placed my hand flat on top of the envelope. I looked Victor Sterling directly in the eyes, and I slowly pushed the offer back across the glass table. Victor's eyebrows raised a fraction of an inch. His expression remained calm, but I could see the genuine surprise flickering in his dark eyes. "Is the compensation not to your liking, Camille? Because I am willing to negotiate equity options after your first year." "The compensation is more than generous, Victor," I replied, my voice steady and resolute. "But I am absolutely done being an employee. I have spent the last 10 years building wealth and security for someone else. I am not going to do it again, not even for you." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with intense, predatory interest. "Then why did you take this meeting?" "Because I want to make you a counteroffer," I said, opening my briefcase and pulling out a sleek, leather-bound folder I had prepared that morning. I placed it on the table between us. "I am launching my own independent compliance consulting firm. I have the master license, I have the operational brainpower, And most importantly, I have the absolute trust of the largest logistics clients on the Eastern Seaboard. I want Vanguard to be my first anchor client. Victor did not reach for the folder immediately. He rested his chin on his hand, testing my resolve. You want to operate as an independent contractor. You want to retain your own autonomy while utilizing my corporate infrastructure to move freight. Exactly, I confirmed, leaning forward. I will bring my federal credentials and my client relationships to the table. I will clear your international cargo and ensure Vanguard remains the most compliant, efficient logistics network in the country. In exchange, my firm retains its independence, and you pay me a retainer of $500,000 a year. Victor let out a low whistle, a genuine smile breaking across his face. He recognized exactly what I was doing. I was not just asking for money. I was asking for power. You have a lot of audacity, Camille. You are sitting in my office without a registered company, without a team, and you are demanding $500,000. I do not have a registered company yet, I corrected him smoothly. But I do have something much more valuable. I have the direct phone numbers of the 3 largest clients currently trying to break their contracts with my brother. As we speak, there is an automotive parts distributor with 60 containers rotting on the tarmac in Savannah. They are bleeding cash. If we sign this partnership right now, I can legally port their entire supply chain over to Vanguard's network by sunset. You get the market share you have always wanted, and I get my empire. Victor stared at me for a long, silent moment. The heavy air in the penthouse seemed to crackle with electric potential. He was a man who respected ruthlessness, and he was looking at a woman who had just weaponized her own termination to orchestrate a hostile takeover of her brother's client base. He reached across the table, completely bypassing his original envelope, and opened my folder. He read through my proposed terms with rapid, focused efficiency. He pulled a heavy gold pen from his inner pocket and signed his name on the dotted line. Welcome to the new era of logistics, Camille, Victor said, extending his hand across the table once more. I shook his hand, the grip firm and victorious. I did not waste another second. I packed my briefcase, walked out of the penthouse, and took the elevator back down to the lobby. The moment I stepped out into the bustling city street, I pulled out my phone and called my corporate attorney. Within 30 minutes, my new independent limited liability company was officially registered and expedited through the state database. I sat on a quiet park bench near the courthouse and pulled up my contact list. I dialed the chief operating officer of the automotive parts distributor. He answered on the second ring, his voice frantic and exhausted from dealing with Jamal's catastrophic failure. Camille, he practically shouted into the receiver. Your brother is not returning my calls. We are facing a $500,000 penalty, and no one at your headquarters can tell me how to get our freight released. I am no longer with that firm, I explained calmly, maintaining my absolute professional composure. But I am calling to offer you a legal bridge. I have launched my own independent compliance firm, partnered directly with Vanguard Logistics. If you sign a broker transfer agreement right now, I can legally reroute your entire supply chain through my new credentials. I can have those Savannah containers moving before midnight. There was no hesitation. The executive did not care about family loyalty or corporate politics. He cared about survival. Send me the paperwork right now, he demanded. We are terminating our contract with your brother's firm immediately. I sent the digital contracts from my phone. Over the next 4 hours, I made similar calls to 2 other massive international clients who were currently trapped in Jamal's operational gridlock. I offered them the exact same lifeline, a seamless, federally compliant transition to my new independent firm, backed by Vanguard's flawless transportation infrastructure. By sunset, all 3 contracts were signed, sealed, and legally binding. I sat on the park bench watching the city lights begin to flicker to life against the darkening sky. In less than 24 hours, my brother and sister-in-law had thrown me out like trash to protect their unearned privilege. In response, I had just legally stripped his corporate empire down to the bare bone. The revenue loss from those 3 fleeing clients alone would push his remaining operating budget deep into the red. My phone vibrated in my hand. It was a news alert from a prominent supply chain industry blog. The headline read, Family Logistics Giant Faces, Federal Freeze, Amidst Mass Client Exodus. The collapse was no longer a private family dispute. It was public knowledge. I stood up, smoothed my crimson suit, and walked toward my car. The real storm had not even started yet, because while Jamal was drowning in federal fines and Harper was crying over her lost luxury, the true architect of this toxic family dynamic was about to wake up. My father's luxury cruise ship was scheduled to dock in Miami the following morning, and he was about to turn his cell phone back on. My employment contract clearly stated that upon involuntary termination, all federal certifications and customs licenses maintained by me on behalf of the company would be immediately and permanently invalidated. When my brother and his newly appointed human resources director wife decided to fire me to free up the executive budget, they completely forgot that my personal credentials were the only thing keeping our family $50 million supply chain empire legally operational. I simply smiled, signed the severance papers, and waited for the Port Authority to freeze every single cargo container they had in transit. The glow of the city's skyline reflected in my phone screen as I sat on that park bench watching the news alerts roll in. The public hemorrhage of my family company was no longer a secret confined to the shipping ports. It was bleeding out into the financial sector. When the federal government initiates an active fraud investigation against a corporate entity, they do not politely ask you to pause your operations. They drop an iron curtain over every single asset attached to the corporate tax identification number. That meant the company bank accounts were completely paralyzed. Jamal could not wire money to vendors. He could not pay the utility bills for the warehouses. And most critically, because it was currently the second Friday of the month, he could not run the company payroll. I walked back to my apartment that night feeling a profound sense of closure. I slept for a solid 8 hours. It was the first time in 10 years I had not woken up in the middle of the night checking my email for overseas customs delays. When I woke up the next morning, the sunlight was pouring through my windows. I made myself a cup of premium dark roast coffee and opened my laptop at my kitchen island. My new consulting firm was already fully operational. The executives at Vanguard Logistics had integrated my credentials into their system flawlessly. The 3 massive clients I had pulled from Jamal were already seeing their frozen containers moving out of the Savannah port. I was tracking their freight on my screen, watching the status indicators turn from a locked-down red to a beautiful compliant green. I was generating my own wealth now, and I was doing it on my own terms. While I was drinking my coffee in absolute peace, the situation at my father headquarters was devolving into a full-scale riot. Through texts from a few loyal former colleagues, I learned exactly what was happening on the ground. When the employees checked their bank accounts that morning and saw no direct deposits, the bullpen erupted. Harper, as the newly appointed Human Resources Director, was supposed to handle the crisis. Instead of facing the hardworking people who relied on those paychecks to feed their families, she locked herself inside the executive suite. She refused to answer her office phone. Jamal was apparently pacing the hallways, sweating through his designer suit, trying to scream at the banking representatives over the phone. But you cannot scream at a federal freeze. The bank simply read him a legally mandated script, informing him that all funds were seized, pending clearance from Homeland Security. My mother, Yvonne, was completely useless. She had spent her entire life shielding Jamal from the consequences of failing college courses and wrecking sports cars. She had absolutely no framework for how to shield him from federal indictments and a mutiny of unpaid logistics workers. She could only sit in his office and watch his unearned authority evaporate into thin air. But the ultimate reckoning was not going to come from the Port Authority or the unpaid employees. The true storm was currently docking at a private port in Miami, Florida. My father, Elijah, had spent the last 30 days on a luxury cruise traversing the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. Elijah was a proud, deeply stubborn African-American man who had built his logistics empire from a single leased delivery truck in the 1980s. He was old school. When he went on vacation, he completely disconnected. No emails, no business calls, no corporate updates. He believed that promoting his only son to vice president meant his legacy was in capable hands. I believed the company would continue to print money while he enjoyed the fruits of his labor. He had no idea that his golden child had decided to play human resources games and fire the only person keeping his empire out of federal prison. I could picture the exact moment reality hit him. I knew my father. I knew he probably walked off the gangway of the cruise ship wearing a crisp linen shirt taking in the warm Miami breeze. I knew he probably handed his luggage to a porter and finally pulled his cell phone out of his pocket to turn off airplane mode. I expected to see a few routine updates from his board of directors. Perhaps a text from Yvonne about dinner plans. Instead, the moment his phone connected to the cellular network, it must have practically vibrated out of his hands. 147 missed calls. Dozens of frantic voicemails from the corporate legal team. Urgent messages from the board of directors demanding an emergency summit. And sitting at the very top of his inbox, an official digital notification forwarded by his primary banking institution. The notification outlined a $4 million federal fine and the absolute suspension of his corporate operating bond, his life work, his entire legacy. It was completely in ashes. I knew my mother had probably left him a dozen tearful voicemails trying to spin the narrative. She would have tried to blame the government or blame the software or worst of all, blame me. She would have told him that I abandoned the family and sabotaged Jamal out of spite. But my father, for all his flaws and his blind spots regarding my brother, was a brilliant businessman. He did not build a $50 million empire by believing convenient lies. He knew that federal agents do not raid a corporate headquarters because of a family disagreement. They raid a headquarters because a massive catastrophic law has been broken. He knew Jamal lacked the discipline to understand customs law. He knew Harper lacked the intelligence to manage a corporate crisis. And he knew that for the last 10 years, I was the only reason his freight crossed international borders without a single compliance violation. I was sitting at my kitchen island watching the morning news on my television when my cell phone chimed. I looked down at the screen. The name Elijah appeared in bold black letters. He did not call me. He knew I would not answer a phone call just to be yelled at. He knew the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. I opened the text message. It was a single line of text devoid of any greetings or pleasantries. "What the hell did your brother do?" I stared at those 7 words. A wave of profound vindication washed through my chest. For a decade, my father had taken my expertise for granted. He had allowed my mother to coddle Jamal while I carried the weight of the corporate liability. He had allowed them to treat me like a subordinate in a company that survived entirely on my credentials. Now the patriarch was awake, and he was standing in the ruins of his own blind trust. I set my coffee mug down on the granite countertop. I typed my response with the exact same clinical precision I used to clear his cargo. Harper terminated me effective immediately to free up budget for Jamal. They revoked my federal license affiliation. Jamal then had an unlicensed 25-year-old forge my federal signature to move freight. The company is frozen. The feds are inside the building. You have no operating license. I suggest you fly home immediately. I hit send. I did not add any emotional padding. I did not offer to help him fix it. I simply handed him the brutal, unvarnished truth. I locked my phone and slid it into my purse. I had a full day of onboarding my new Vanguard clients, and I was not going to waste another second worrying about the fires burning in my father's house. The fallout was no longer my responsibility. I had built my own lifeboat, and I was already sailing away. My father did not waste time sending follow-up text messages. Elijah was a man of immediate and forceful action. Within hours of receiving my brutal summary of the situation, he had chartered a private flight out of Miami, leaving his luxury vacation and my mother behind to deal with the luggage. He flew through the night on a red-eye, touching down in Atlanta, just as the sun was beginning to rise over a company that was currently hemorrhaging millions of dollars by the hour. At exactly 8:00 the next morning, my cell phone rang. It was not my father. It was his executive assistant, a woman who had worked for our family for 15 years. Her voice was trembling tight with anxiety as she informed me that Elijah had summoned an emergency meeting of the board of directors. She told me he demanded my immediate presence in the main conference room. I listened to her panicked breathing over the line, and I responded with absolute unwavering calm. I told her I would be happy to attend the meeting, but I needed her to understand the parameters of my visit. I reminded her that I was legally terminated without cause exactly 1 week ago. I no longer held an employee badge. I no longer reported to the executive branch. I told her that if I stepped foot inside that building, I would be arriving as the chief executive officer of my own independent compliance firm. I requested a formal visitor badge and an official guest invitation. There was a brief pause followed by a quiet, respectful confirmation. She understood exactly what I was doing. I was establishing the New World Order before I even walked through the front doors. I took my time getting ready that morning. I did not rush. I did not feel the familiar crushing anxiety that used to dictate my every movement when working under my family's chaotic management. I stood in front of my closet and bypassed the muted conservative clothing my mother always pressured me to wear so I would not overshadow my brother. Instead, I pulled out a custom-tailored deep emerald green designer suit. It was immaculate sharp and projected an aura of absolute authority. I paired it with black stiletto heels that echoed with purpose. I gathered my documents carefully, placing the severance agreement Harper had forced me to sign into my sleek leather briefcase. When I pulled into the executive parking garage of my father's corporate headquarters, the contrast to my departure a week prior was almost cinematic. I walked across the expansive marble lobby. The same security guards who had been ordered by Harper to escort me out of the building like a corporate spy now practically stood at attention when they saw me approach. They did not ask for my identification. The head guard simply handed me a printed visitor badge, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound respect and desperate hope. I clipped the visitor badge to the lapel of my emerald blazer. The symbolism was heavy, deliberate, and entirely satisfying. I made my way to the elevators and rode up to the executive floor. When the metal doors slid open, the atmosphere that greeted me was thick, heavy, and suffocating. The main bullpen was a portrait of corporate despair. The employees, the hardworking people whose paychecks had just bounced because Jamal's gross incompetence triggered a federal asset freeze, were huddled in small groups. Some were packing their personal belongings into cardboard boxes, fearing the company was going into immediate liquidation. When they saw me walking down the central aisle, the conversations abruptly stopped. They parted like the Red Sea, watching me move toward the executive wing with a quiet, reverent silence. They knew I was the only person who possessed the leverage and the intellect to navigate the federal nightmare currently strangling their livelihoods. I approached the heavy glass doors of the main conference room. It was the exact same sterile glass-walled room where I had been ambushed and stripped of my title just 7 days ago. I gripped the cool metal handle, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The shift in the room's power dynamic was palpable the second I crossed the threshold. My father sat at the head of the long mahogany table. Elijah looked like he had aged a decade in the span of 48 hours. He had not bothered to change out of the clothes he traveled in. He was wearing wrinkled linen trousers and a dark button-down shirt, completely abandoning his usual polished corporate armor. His hands were clasped tightly together on the table, his knuckles white. His jaw was clenched so hard I could see a muscle ticking violently in his cheek. He radiated a quiet, terrifying foundational fury. To his immediate right sat Jamal, my older brother, the undisputed golden child who had demanded my salary to fund his custom-built mansion, looked absolutely destroyed. His designer suit was rumpled and hanging off his shoulders. He had dark, bruised circles under his bloodshot eyes, clearly indicating he had not slept a single minute since the federal agents had stormed his lobby. The unearned arrogance that had defined his entire existence was entirely stripped away. He sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the wood grain of the table, drowning in the panicked realization that he had just single-handedly ruined his own life. Beside him sat Harper, the pristine white woman who had played human resources director and smugly lectured me about synergy was completely unrecognizable. The corporate confidence she had weaponized against me was gone. She was deathly pale, her hands trembling visibly as she clutched a legal notepad. Her perfect blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, frantic knot. She refused to make eye contact with anyone in the room. She looked terrified, finally comprehending that federal fraud is not a minor corporate inconvenience that can be swept under the rug or blamed on an entry-level subordinate. I did not hesitate. I did not break my stride. I walked confidently down the length of the room to the opposite end of the mahogany table, positioning myself directly across from my father. I set my leather briefcase down on the polished wood. The soft, authoritative thud echoed through the silent room like a gavel striking a sound block. I pulled out my high-backed leather chair and took my seat. I crossed my legs, rested my hands perfectly still on the table, and looked directly at my father. I was completely composed, entirely untouched by the panic suffocating the rest of my family. I sat in the exact same chair where I had been unjustly fired, but this time I was the one holding all the cards, and I waited patiently for the interrogation to begin. The silence in the conference room was heavy, pressing down on us like physical weight. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint rhythmic ticking of Jamal's gold watch, a cruel reminder of the time slipping away from him. My father leaned forward, pressing his forearms against the edge of the mahogany table. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously low. It was not the booming, charismatic tone he used at industry galas or family cookouts. It was the voice of a man who had pulled himself out of poverty, built a logistics empire from a single leased truck, and was now watching it burn to the ground. "Someone in this room," my father began, enunciating every single syllable with terrifying precision, "is going to explain to me why I stepped off a ship to find a $4 million federal fine sitting in my inbox. Someone is going to explain why the corporate accounts are frozen, why my employees are packing their desks, and why the Department of Homeland Security currently has a padlock on our main server room." He shifted his dark, piercing gaze slowly from me to Harper and finally settling on Jamal. "Well," he demanded, the volume of his voice spiking sharply, cracking the silence like a whip. "Explain it to me, Mr. Vice President." Jamal physically recoiled in his chair. He opened his mouth, but for a second no sound came out. The unearned privilege that had protected him his entire life was completely useless against federal indictments and our father's absolute wrath. "Dad, listen. It is a massive misunderstanding." Jamal stammered, his voice climbing to a frantic, high-pitched register. "We experienced a malicious information technology system error. The Port Authority portal glitched during a routine software update. We were just trying to modernize the workflow like we discussed before you left." "A routine software update," my father repeated, his tone dripping with lethal skepticism. "A software update triggered a federal fraud investigation." Jamal swallowed hard, reaching up to loosen his designer silk tie. His forehead was gleaming with sweat. "Yes. Well, no. It was not just the software. It was Camille." He pointed a shaking finger directly at me across the table. I did not blink. I did not move. I just watched him spin his pathetic web of lies. "She sabotaged us," Dad Jamal lied, the desperation making him bold. "She could not handle the new leadership structure. When I took over as vice president, she became completely hostile and uncooperative. She was bitter that she had to report to me. So she locked us out of the customs portal on purpose to hold the company hostage. She is trying to destroy everything you built just because she is jealous." Harper, sensing an opening, eagerly jumped in to support her husband's desperate fabrication. She sat up straighter, attempting to channel the human resources authority she absolutely did not possess. "It is true," Elijah Harper said, her voice wavering slightly. "Camille was creating a highly toxic work environment. She was entirely resistant to our synergy initiatives. We had a performance review meeting with her last week, and she became completely belligerent. We had no choice but to initiate a transition plan, and in retaliation, she maliciously revoked the company access to the federal networks. We were the victims of corporate sabotage." They sat there, a united front of profound incompetence, hoping that my father's historical blind spot for Jamal would save them. They were betting on the old family dynamic. They expected my father to turn to me, demand that I apologize, and force me to fix my brother's mistake to protect the family name. My father slowly turned his head to face me. The disappointment radiating from him was palpable, but it was not directed at me. I could see the gears turning in his mind. He was a veteran of the logistics industry. He knew that an information technology glitch did not summon federal agents with windbreakers and clipboards. "Is this true?" Camille, my father, asked quietly, his eyes searching my face for any sign of guilt. "Did you intentionally sabotage the operational grid because you were angry with your brother?" I kept my posture perfectly relaxed. I looked at the man who had let my mother coddle his son for 38 years, the man who had allowed my brilliance to be overshadowed by my brother's mediocrity. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my character against Harper's absurd allegations. Arguing would imply that this was a debate. It was not a debate. It was an execution. I reached for the brass clasps of my leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly in the tense silence of the room. I opened the flap and pulled out the crisp white severance agreement that Harper had forced me to sign exactly 7 days ago. I am not going to waste your time arguing about synergy or malicious glitches. Dad, I said, keeping my voice smooth and perfectly level, I am just going to show you the facts. I slid the document across the long mahogany table. It glided over the polished wood and came to a stop directly in front of his clasped hands. My father looked down at the paper. He recognized the corporate letterhead immediately. Turn to page 4, I instructed calmly. Read the paragraph highlighted under the termination clause. The room was dead silent as my father flipped the pages. Jamal was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically between me and our father. Harper looked like she was going to be physically sick. My father's eyes scanned the legal text. I watched his expression change. I watched the initial confusion curdle into profound, undeniable horror as his eyes reached Harper's signature at the bottom of the page, right next to mine. He read the clause that explicitly stated that upon my immediate involuntary termination, my personal federal customs license was completely severed from the company. He slowly lowered the document back to the table. He did not look at Jamal. He did not look at Harper. He stared blankly at the wood grain, the devastating reality of the situation washing over him like freezing water. They did not fire a redundant employee. Dad, I stated clearly, my voice carrying the absolute weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. Harper wanted to save $120,000 so they could afford the cost overruns on Jamal's new custom mansion. They terminated me without cause. They waived the 30-day transition period. They demanded a clean break effective immediately. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table. It cost you a $50 million company. Because when they threw me out of the building to protect their fragile egos, they fired the firm's only federal customs principal. They severed the only license keeping your business legal. And then, when the ports locked them out, Jamal ordered his unlicensed frat buddy replacement to forge my federal signature to try and cover it up. I sat back in my chair, letting the brutal, unvarnished truth settle over the room. I did not sabotage your empire, Dad, I said softly. I simply packed my desk and followed Harper's human resources protocol to the letter. Your golden child did this all on his own. My father continued to stare at the severance agreement resting on the mahogany table. The color slowly drained from his face, replaced by an ashen, sickly gray. For 38 years he had operated under the delusion that his son was merely a late bloomer, a charismatic heir who just needed the right title to finally step up and lead. That delusion was currently bleeding out on the conference room table. He looked at the signature line. He looked at Harper's name scrawled in blue ink, authorizing the complete decapitation of his logistics empire. The tense silence shattered when Harper let out a high-pitched, desperate sob. She shoved her chair back, the legs screeching against the hardwood floor. She pointed a trembling finger at me, tears spilling over her mascara as she frantically tried to play the victim. She tricked me! Elijah Harper cried, her voice cracking with manufactured panic. She set a trap. She knew I was new to the human resources director role. She sat in this exact room and watched me sign that paper, and she never said a single word about the federal license. She maliciously withheld company information to destroy us. I did not raise my voice. I simply let her finish her theatrical performance before I systematically dismantled her. Harper, I said, the cold clarity of my words cutting right through her sobbing. You called me into this room to eliminate my redundancy. You explicitly stated that my salary was a drain on Jamal's new strategic initiatives. I asked you on the record if you were absolutely certain you wanted to waive the standard 30-day transition period. You laughed in my face. You told me my presence was toxic and demanded an immediate clean break. You then had armed security march me through the bullpen like a common thief. I leaned forward, locking my eyes onto hers, ensuring she felt the full weight of her own incompetence. It is not the responsibility of a terminated employee to audit the company operational liabilities, I continued. You are the Director of Human Resources. It is your absolute legal obligation to know the regulatory credentials of the staff you are firing. You did not read my contract because you were too busy calculating the down payment for your custom wine cellar. My father stood up. The sudden violent movement knocked his heavy leather chair backward, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Harper gasped and shrank back into her seat. Jamal squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for an impact he knew he could not escape. A custom wine cellar, my father repeated. His voice was a terrifying guttural whisper that vibrated with absolute rage. He turned his head slowly to look at his only son. I left you in charge of my legacy. I gave you the keys to a kingdom I spent 40 years breaking my back to build. And you gutted my compliance division to pay for a house. Dad, please, you have to understand. Jamal pleaded, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. We were going to automate the system. Tanner said we could outsource the clearance processing. I was trying to modernize the budget. Tanner is a 25-year-old communications major, my father roared. The explosion of his voice shook the glass walls of the conference room. You hired a fraternity brother to manage the Department of Homeland Security. You forged a federal document. Are you out of your mind? You arrogant, incompetent fool. My father slammed both of his fists onto the table, leaning directly over Jamal. I built this company from a single leased delivery truck in 1985. He shouted, the veins standing out on his neck. I fought systemic barriers to build a minority-owned enterprise so that my children would never have to beg for a seat at the corporate table. And you tore it down in a week. You sold out your own sister, the only person who actually understood the blood and sweat poured into this foundation so your wife could play executive. Decades of carefully constructed excuses vanished in that instant. Every single time my mother had begged him to give Jamal another chance, every failed business venture, every bailed-out mistake, all of it was burned away by the harsh light of reality. The veil was violently ripped away. My father finally saw Jamal for exactly what he was. A hollow, entitled fraud who possessed absolutely none of the grit or intellect required to lead. And in that same blinding moment of clarity, my father realized the profound truth I had known for 10 years. Jamal was not the future of the company. I was. I had always been the sole load-bearing pillar holding his entire empire together, and he had allowed me to be treated like an expendable subordinate. My father turned away from Jamal in utter disgust. The towering rage seemed to physically drain out of his body, leaving behind a profound, devastating desperation. He looked at me, and for the first time in my entire adult life, the powerful patriarch of our family looked completely broken. Camille, my father said, his voice cracking thick with an emotion I had never heard him direct toward me before. It was sheer, unadulterated panic. I am sorry. I am so deeply sorry that I let this happen. I should never have left him in charge. I was blind. He placed his hands flat on the mahogany table, leaning toward me, as if I were a lifeline in a turbulent, freezing ocean. Please, I am begging you. He pleaded, his voice breaking under the weight of his collapsing empire. I will fire Harper right now. I will strip Jamal of his title and have security escort them both out of the building today. You can have your corner office back. I will double your salary. I will give you whatever executive title you want. Just please, Camille. Tell me you can call your contacts at the Port Authority. Tell me you can log back in and turn the lights back on. Please come back to us. The silence in the conference room was profound. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a battlefield immediately following a devastating bombardment. I stared at my father, watching the desperation contort his features. He was offering me everything I had spent the last decade begging for: a corner office, a doubled salary, the respect and authority I had earned 100 times over. I was offering to publicly execute Jamal's career and strip Harper of her unearned title right there in front of me. For a brief, fleeting second, the inner child in me, the daughter who had always just wanted her father's validation, felt a pang of profound grief. It took the absolute destruction of his life's work for him to finally see my worth. But that inner child was gone. In her place sat a woman who had been forged in the fires of federal regulations and corporate survival. I looked at Jamal, who was currently staring at his hands, completely paralyzed by the realization that our father was offering him up as a sacrificial lamb. I looked at Harper, whose manufactured tears were now genuine, her shoulders shaking as the reality of her impending financial ruin set in. Then I brought my gaze back to my father. "You are missing the point, Dad," I said, my voice completely devoid of anger or malice. It was smooth, steady, and terrifyingly calm. "I do not want a corner office in this building. I do not want to be your senior vice president. And I certainly do not want you to double my salary." My father blinked, the desperation in his eyes morphing into profound confusion. "What are you talking about, Camille? I am giving you everything. I am giving you the company. You cannot give me what I already possess," I replied gently. "I am not an employee anymore. I am never going to be an employee again. I refuse to wear a corporate leash, especially one held by a family that only values me when they are drowning. I already have a job, Dad. I am the CEO of my own firm now." My father opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger. I reached down to my leather briefcase resting on the table. The brass locks clicked sharply in the quiet room. I opened the flap and pulled out a thick, impeccably bound legal document. I placed my hand flat on the cover page and slowly slid it across the long mahogany table. It stopped precisely an inch from my father's clasped hands. "I am not asking for my job back," I stated clearly, my eyes locking onto his. "I am offering a corporate acquisition of your compliance department." My father looked down at the document. The cover page displayed the bold, embossed logo of my newly registered independent compliance firm. He reached out with trembling fingers and opened to the first page. "Let me explain the reality of your current situation." I continued dictating the terms with the practiced cadence of a seasoned corporate raider. "As we sit here, you are facing a $4 million federal fine. Your operating accounts are frozen. Your payroll has bounced. And as of yesterday evening, 3 of your largest international clients officially terminated their contracts with you." Jamal's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes wide with fresh horror. "What? Which clients?" I ignored my brother entirely, keeping my focus solely on my father. "They terminated their contracts with you because they signed new exclusive operational agreements with my firm. I legally ported their supply chains over to my master license. And because I needed a robust transportation infrastructure to move their freight, I partnered with Victor Sterling. I am currently operating Vanguard Logistics' entire federal compliance division." My father gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of air. Vanguard Logistics was his greatest rival. The realization that I had walked straight into enemy territory and handed them his biggest clients was a masterful, devastating blow. He looked down at the contract in his hands, his eyes racing over the legal text. "You have absolutely no leverage." "Dad," I explained, my tone entirely pragmatic, "but I am not here to watch your legacy burn to the ground. I am here to offer you a lifeline. That contract outlines a binding operational agreement between your company and my independent firm. If you sign it, my team will immediately step in, interface with Homeland Security, pay the administrative penalties, and reinstate your federal operating bonds. I will clear your gridlock and get your trucks moving before midnight." My father flipped to the compensation clause. I watched his eyes widen as he read the numbers. "I am not going to be on your payroll," I said. "You are going to pay my firm a retainer of $500,000 a year for complete regulatory management. My firm will retain absolute operational autonomy. We do not report to your executive board. We do not report to human resources. We report only to federal law." My father swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edges of the contract. "Camille, this is $500,000 a year. The company is bleeding cash. We have a $4 million fine to pay. How am I supposed to fund this retainer?" I leaned back in my leather chair, resting my hands in my lap. I looked directly at Jamal, then shifted my gaze to Harper. "That brings me to Section 4 of the agreement," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the entire room. "In order for my firm to legally associate with your corporate entity, I require the immediate permanent removal of all systemic liabilities. Jamal and Harper must be stripped of all executive titles effective immediately. They are to be barred from entering the building or accessing any company networks." Jamal let out a strangled, breathless sound. "Dad, you cannot do this. You cannot let her do this to me. Furthermore, I continued speaking over my brother's pathetic whimpering. Jamal's 10% equity stake in this company must be fully liquidated by the end of the business day. The proceeds from his liquidated shares will be used to pay the $4 million federal fine he caused by forging my signature. Any remaining funds will be used to cover my firm's first-year retainer. Harper covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The custom mansion, the designer clothes, the country club memberships, all of it was instantly vaporized. They were not just being fired, they were being financially stripped to the bone to pay for their own catastrophic arrogance. My terms are brutal. Dad, I acknowledged quietly, watching my father read through the airtight legal stipulations. But they are completely non-negotiable. You can sign that contract right now, liquidate your son's shares, and save the company you spent 40 years building. Or you can slide that paper back across the table, and I will walk out of this room and let the federal government seize every single asset you own. The choice was his. He could choose his golden child, or he could choose his empire. I sat in perfect silence, waiting for the patriarch to make the most expensive decision of his life. My father stared at the thick stack of paper resting in front of him. I did not rush him. I leaned back in my leather chair and let the reality of the numbers sink deep into his bones. "You are reading Section 3, I said smoothly, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the conference room. "That outlines the operational retainer. $500,000 annually paid in monthly installments directly to my independent limited liability company. For that fee, my team will assume full legal liability for your customs brokerage. We will interface with the Department of Homeland Security, pay the administrative penalties, to unlock the federal portals, and get your fleet moving before the sun sets today. But understand this clearly, Dad. My firm operates with absolute autonomy. We do not answer to your executive board. We answer to the federal government. You will never again have the power to terminate the license that keeps your trucks on the highway." My father swallowed hard. He slowly turned the page. I watched his eyes track the text of Section 4, and as I did, I shifted my gaze to my older brother. Jamal was sweating profusely, his hands trembling violently where they rested on his knees. Harper was practically hyperventilating next to him, her breath hitching in her chest. "Section 4 is the non-negotiable contingency," I continued, ensuring my voice carried to every corner of the glass-walled room. "Jamal and Harper are to be stripped of all executive titles and corporate access immediately. Furthermore, Jamal holds a 10% equity stake in this company. That equity must be fully liquidated by the close of business today." Jamal let out a sound like a wounded animal. "Dad, you cannot do this," he gasped, looking at our father with wide, terrified eyes. "My shares are worth millions. That is my future. That is my house. You cannot let her take everything from me." I did not let my father answer. "Your shares are going to be used to pay the $4 million federal fine you incurred when you directed an unlicensed frat boy to forge my federal signature," I stated coldly. "Whatever is left over after the federal government takes their cut will be applied to my firm's first-year retainer. You are not just being fired, Jamal. You are paying for the privilege of your own catastrophic incompetence." Harper buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with loud, ugly sobs. The reality of her situation was finally crashing down around her, shattering her unearned arrogance into a million pieces. The custom-built 6-bedroom mansion was gone. The Italian marble countertops were gone. The exclusive country club memberships and the luxury vehicles were instantly vaporized. She had fired me to free up $120,000 to fund her extravagant lifestyle, and in return, I had legally stripped her and her husband down to their absolute bare foundation. They would be leaving this building with absolutely nothing. My father looked up from the contract. He looked at Jamal, the son he had spent a lifetime propping up, the boy he had endlessly forgiven in the name of family legacy. He looked at Harper, the woman who had happily played the role of corporate executioner without understanding the weapon she wielded. Then he looked at me. The disappointment in his eyes was profound, but the business acumen that had built his $50 million empire was taking over. He knew I had him completely cornered. I knew my terms were the only life raft available in a sea of federal indictments and bankruptcy proceedings. Before my father could reach into his pocket for a pen, the heavy glass doors of the conference room burst open. The sudden noise made everyone jump. My mother, Yvonne, rushed into the room, pushing past a startled administrative assistant. Her designer handbag was slipping off her shoulder, and her usually immaculate hair was slightly disheveled. She had clearly driven straight from my apartment after our confrontation, speeding across Atlanta to try and salvage the wreckage of her golden child's life. She took one look at the scene in the room: the weeping daughter-in-law, the terrified son, the grim patriarch, and me sitting calmly at the end of the table. "Elijah, do not sign anything!" My mother cried out, rushing to stand behind Jamal and wrapping her arms protectively around his shoulders. Jamal buried his face in his hands, leaning into her embrace like a frightened child seeking shelter. Yvonne glared at me with an intensity that could have melted glass. "Camille, you cannot do this to your brother. You are destroying his life over a simple mistake. He is blood. We are a family. You cannot take his shares and leave him with nothing. You are supposed to help him." I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of intimidation. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life teaching me that my only value was in how well I served my brother. "Mom," I said evenly, "family did not seem to matter to you last week when you told me to pack my desk and take a 2-week severance check. Family did not matter to you 2 hours ago when you demanded I hand over my federal credentials so Jamal could commit identity theft and cover up his crimes. You told me to step aside and let him lead. I am simply letting him pay the cost of leadership." "You are a vindictive, selfish girl," Yvonne screamed, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "Elijah, tell her to stop this nonsense. Tell her to fix the system and give Jamal his job back. We can pay the fines out of the corporate reserve. We do not need to ruin our son to save the business." My father watched my mother coddle a 38-year-old man who had just nearly sent them all to federal prison. He watched Jamal hide behind his mother's skirt instead of facing the consequences of his actions like a man. For the first time in his life, Elijah seemed to truly see the toxic dynamic he had allowed to fester in his home and his business. He saw how Yvonne's relentless enabling had created a weak, arrogant man, completely incapable of handling real responsibility. He saw that trying to protect Jamal had nearly cost him his entire legacy. My father looked away from my mother. He looked down at my impeccable, airtight contract. He picked up his gold pen, uncapped it, and positioned it over the signature line. The choice was final. The gold pen hovered over the thick parchment. My mother let out a shrill, desperate sound, lunging forward, as if she meant to physically snatch the pen from his grip. Elijah slammed his free hand down on the mahogany table with such explosive force that the heavy glass water pitchers rattled. My mother stopped dead in her tracks. For 38 years, she had run our household by employing a relentless combination of guilt manipulation and emotional outbursts. She was entirely accustomed to my father capitulating just to keep the peace. But the man sitting at the head of the table right now was not a weary husband trying to avoid an argument. I was a chief executive officer bleeding millions of dollars watching his life work turn to ash. "Do not touch that contract, Yvonne," my father commanded. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, vibrating growl that commanded absolute submission. "Elijah, please," my mother begged, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. "You are taking everything from him. You are leaving him with nothing. He is your son." "High is a liability," my father replied, staring directly into my mother's eyes. "I spent 4 decades breaking my back to build a minority-owned logistics empire in a world that wanted to see me fail. I built a table so my children would never have to beg anyone for a seat. I handed Jamal the keys to a kingdom. I gave him a vice president title he did not earn, a salary he did not deserve, and the benefit of every single doubt. And what did he do with my legacy? He fired the only person who actually understood the business so his new wife could play corporate boss. He committed federal fraud. He nearly sent himself and me to federal prison." My mother opened her mouth to argue, to formulate another excuse, but she had absolutely nothing left to say. The facts were written in federal indictments and empty bank accounts. My father turned his attention to Jamal. My older brother was trembling visibly. His tailored suit practically swallowed him whole. He looked incredibly small. "I enabled you, Jamal." My father said, the profound disappointment in his voice cutting deeper than any anger ever could. Your mother coddled you, and I allowed it because I wanted you to have a softer life than I did. But a soft life made you weak. It made you arrogant. You have zero respect for the labor that built this foundation. I am liquidating your shares today because you owe this company $4 million. You are going to pay for your own mistakes for the very first time in your life. Dad, please, where am I supposed to go? Jamal whimpered, hiding his face in his hands. How am I supposed to pay for the house? Harper and I have contractors waiting. You should have thought about your contractors before you forged a federal document, my father replied coldly. You are no longer an executive of this firm. You are no longer a shareholder. You are trespassing. My father pressed the gold pen to the paper. The scratching sound of the nib against the thick parchment filled the silent room. He signed his name with sharp, decisive strokes on the bottom of every single page. He flipped to the final signature line, executing the complete operational acquisition of his compliance department to my independent firm. He closed the leather folder and slid it back across the table to me. I placed my hand on the contract, securing my empire. My father reached across the table and pressed the button on the main intercom console. Yes, Mr. Chief Executive Officer. The administrative assistant answered, her voice shaking slightly through the speaker. Call down to the lobby, my father ordered. Send the head of security up to the main conference room immediately. We have 2 unauthorized individuals who need an escort off the premises. Harper let out a loud, dramatic wail. She grabbed Jamal's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. She was a white woman from a wealthy suburb who had married into a successful African-American family, expecting a lifetime of unearned luxury. She had arrogantly assumed she could waltz into our corporate headquarters, eliminate my redundancy, and fund her custom-built mansion with my salary. Now she was sitting in a glass-walled room, realizing that she was about to be forcibly removed from a building she did not own and thrust into catastrophic financial ruin. We cannot leave, Harper cried, staring wildly at my father. Our cars are in the executive garage. My personal items are in my office. You cannot just throw us out onto the street like criminals. You will be given 10 minutes to gather your personal effects under strict supervision, my father replied, staring at her with undisguised contempt. Your company vehicles belong to the corporate fleet. You will leave the keys on the table. I highly suggest you call a rideshare. The heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open. 2 large security guards stepped into the room. I recognized them instantly. They were the exact same guards Harper had smugly ordered to escort me through the bullpen just 1 week prior. The poetic justice of the moment was so absolute it felt choreographed. The taller guard looked at my father, awaiting instructions. Mr. and Mrs. Former Vice President are no longer affiliated with this company, my father instructed, gesturing toward Jamal and Harper. Escort them to their offices to collect their keys and personal items. Do not let them touch any computers or corporate files. Once they are done, walk them directly out the front doors. The guards nodded, stepping forward. Jamal stood up slowly, his legs barely supporting his weight. He did not look at me. He did not look at our mother, who was quietly sobbing against the wall. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, completely stripped of his golden child armor. He placed the keys to his company-issued luxury sedan on the mahogany table. Harper stood up next, her face blotchy and red. She was trembling with a potent mixture of rage and profound humiliation. The corporate confidence she had weaponized against me was entirely eradicated. She placed her keys next to Jamal's. As she turned to follow the security guards out of the room, I stood up from my leather chair. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the crisp white envelope Harper had handed me 7 days ago. The exact same envelope that contained the insulting severance package she had offered me after demanding my immediate termination. I walked around the mahogany table, my stiletto heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. I stopped directly in front of Harper, blocking her path to the door. She looked up at me, her blue eyes filled with bitter, defensive tears. I held the white envelope out to her. She stared at it, refusing to take it. I took your advice, Harper, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly balanced. I embrace the synergy of this transition. I am leaving you the 2 weeks of severance pay you so generously offered me last week. It will not cover the cost of the Italian marble countertops you ordered for your new kitchen, but it should help with the landscaping. I reached forward and tucked the white envelope neatly into the front pocket of her beige blazer. For the mortgage, I whispered. Harper let out a choked, humiliated sob. She turned her face away, entirely defeated, and allowed the security guards to lead her out of the conference room. I stood in the doorway, watching them walk down the long hallway toward the elevator banks. The entire bullpen of employees stood in absolute silence, watching the disgraced former executives take the exact same walk of shame they had forced upon me. I turned back to the conference room. My mother was sitting in Jamal's abandoned chair, weeping into her hands. My father remained at the head of the table, looking out at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I picked up my briefcase containing my newly signed multi-million-dollar contract. I did not offer any words of comfort because they were not deserved. I simply walked out of the room, ready to go to work for my own legacy. My mother's luxury SUV remained parked outside our secure gates for over an hour, her digital requests for entry flashing silently on the security monitor until the battery of her patience finally ran out. She drove away knowing that the gilded cage she had built around her new life had finally locked her out for good. In the months that followed that explosive board meeting, the catastrophic fallout of my family's corporate empire played out exactly as I had engineered. Without a legal operating license and suffocated by federal indictments, my father's firm was forced into a massive restructuring. The $4 million federal fine was paid off directly through the complete liquidation of Jamal's 10% equity stake. When his shares were sold at auction, the proceeds barely covered the government penalties and my firm's first-year retainer. The remaining balance of his unearned wealth evaporated overnight. True to form, the moment the money and status dried up, Harper's devotion to my brother vanished. She filed for divorce within 90 days, taking whatever small personal savings she had left and moving back to her affluent suburban family, leaving Jamal behind to face the wreckage. Their custom-built 6-bedroom mansion, only halfway finished with its Italian marble countertops and custom wine cellar, went straight into a brutal foreclosure auction. Jamal was forced to pack what little he owned into the trunk of a used sedan and move back into a modest apartment across town, finally facing the real world with zero safety nets and a permanently stained professional reputation. My mother, Yvonne, was left entirely isolated in a social circle that lived and breathed on gossip and superficial status. The women she used to drink brunch mimosas with at the country club quickly stopped inviting her to events, whispering behind her back about her son's epic corporate failure and her role in enabling it. She tried desperately to rewrite the narrative, claiming she was the true victim of an ungrateful daughter, but no one was buying her rehearsed performance anymore. As for me, I no longer carried the heavy, suffocating burden of being the unappreciated, underpaid scapegoat of a toxic family business. I stood in my new, expansive downtown office, the warm afternoon sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. My private office was a masterpiece of modern design, but more importantly, it represented absolute freedom. On my desk sat the quarterly financial reports for my independent compliance consulting firm. We were currently managing global logistics portfolios, not just for Vanguard Logistics, but for 5 other major international shipping corporations. My father and I had reached a careful, distant professional arrangement. He kept his company afloat by paying my firm its $500,000 annual retainer on the exact first of every month, stripped of all executive control over my division. We exchanged polite clinical greetings during mandatory board check-ins, but the dynamic of control was permanently broken. He finally understood that I was never again going to be his subordinate. I looked at my reflection in the crystal-clear glass of my office window. I was no longer the exhausted woman who had silently accepted a pathetic severance package across a sterile mahogany table. I was the chief executive officer of my own destiny, surrounded by a brilliant, dedicated team that respected my intellect, valued my boundaries, and celebrated my expertise. The revenge wasn't just sweet. It was the most profitable, liberating move of my life. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, If you have ever had your hard work diminished by people who demanded your absolute loyalty while giving none in return, I want you to know that your brilliance does not need their permission to shine. You do not have to shrink yourself to make toxic people comfortable. Have you ever had to walk away from entitled relatives to protect your peace and build your own empire? Tell me your story in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about reclaiming your power, setting unbreakable boundaries, and walking in your absolute truth. Thank you for listening, and always remember that sometimes the absolute best response to disrespect is massive, undeniable.